It's the week ending Saturday the 6th of May, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've heard leaks from Brussels on how initial Brexit talks are going, Diane Abbott grilled on Labour spending plans, and the news that Prince Philip is to retire from royal duties in the autumn. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. The big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. So Ollie's actually off sunning himself this week, so with me today from the week's digital team are Jonathan Harwood, Rebecca Gillie and Ashley Wassall. And to start the show with her top pick of the week, it's Rebecca. What have you brought for us?
Ladies and gentlemen, meet the new leader of the free world, or should I say, die Führerin der freien Welt.
But I pointed out again how important the right to demonstrate is in a civil society, the importance of humanitarian organisations, and I also mentioned again that we have received very negative reports about the way homosexuals are treated in Chechnya. And I asked President Putin to use his influence in order to safeguard the rights of minorities.
That was German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking at a press conference next to Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier this week. Rebecca, Merkel was really just telling it like it is, wasn't she? So why is this your moment of the week?
She was in Sochi speaking to Putin, and they had actually met to talk about the peace process in Ukraine. And she kind of went off on this interesting tangent, really kind of calling him out in a way that you don't see very often anymore on the world stage. And it kind of got me thinking, you know, a lot of people now think that Angela Merkel has taken over as the leader of the free world, position that was traditionally held by the US president, but obviously requires you to be quite a staunch defender of old-fashioned style liberal values, which obviously he has kind of not really proven he's overly committed to or possibly understands. So why is Angela Merkel taking over this role? This is what it's got me thinking. Traditionally, isn't this the kind of thing that the UK would have stepped up to? And instead what we're seeing is, you know, I just think it's ironic that the Leavers' main argument during the referendum campaign was that leaving the EU would put Britain back on the world stage as this global actor. And the irony is now that that role has been stepped into by Angela Merkel, who's the embodiment of the EU and EU values.
How would that role have been being played had it been someone else who was occupying the White House?
Well, first of all, I challenge the assumption that the UK has historically played this role. I mean, you know, we were a country that put Robert Mugabe in a gold-crested horse-drawn cart and sent him up to Buckingham Palace and gave him the full regalia. So we don't have a great history where this is concerned. And in recent history, and you talked about Brexit, we've had Theresa May going out and visiting Saudi Arabia. We had Liam Fox out in the Philippines with Duterte. You know, we're not exactly poster children, I suppose, for protecting rights over, you know, our own self-interest. In fact, I think the UK as a reasonably small nation has pretty much consistently put its self-interest first. The country that has vacated this space is America. Because they rather self-aggrandizingly thought of themselves as the leaders of the free world, and Donald Trump seems to shirk from that title.
And I think Britain has always traditionally thought of itself as a defender of those kind of liberal democratic values as well. You know, where is Theresa May coming out and trying to advocate for human rights on a global platform? Like, isn't that what Britain should be using its leverage for? And what's the point of becoming this grand actor on the global stage again? You know, no one is calling for us to reenact colonialism. So if we do become this independent power, what are we going to use it for? Why isn't Theresa May doing this in Saudi Arabia, for instance?
Well, I think she's wrapped up in an election campaign at the moment, isn't she? So, I mean, we're just eating ourselves in this country right now.
It's become so insular recently.
I think, I mean, it needs a bit of clarity. It needs clear water before it's less than a year since the referendum. We've got a general election coming up. I think there isn't a sort of a situation in which Britain can take the lead because everything's so chaotic. Whereas Angela Merkel, she's been in power for 13 years or something like that. She's got the mandate. She's got this statesman-like demeanour about her. Her country is also the crucible of what's happening in that they've had, nearly 1 million refugees come in there. I mean, they are on the front line. They have to do something. They can't stand aside.
I mean, arguably isn't the reason why Britain isn't intervening in Saudi affairs because the country has very important financial and political connections with Saudi. And isn't it therefore also arguable that Germany is saying this to Putin right now for its own reasons? You know, that it's self-interest that's governing this.
There's an argument to be made that it's better to go to Russia, where at least, you know, gay people are permitted to live, rather than go to Saudi Arabia and start saying, wouldn't it be great if you had gay marriage? You know, the idea that you start with the things that you can change, which obviously is, you know, easier for Germany to use that kind of influence on Russia.
And also with a German election coming up, wasn't this a bit of a warning shot to Putin saying, look, you've intervened in another election, make sure you don't touch ours?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Angela Merkel's party is the one that's traditionally been opposed to gay marriage in Germany and kind of been pushing back against gay rights historically, although, they've now reached this more, they are in favour of civil unions. So it's not as if it's a natural fit for Merkel particularly, but she has stepped up into this role. Now, there's no particular geopolitical benefit for Germany to bring up the persecution of gay men in Chechnya. That, as far as I can see, and maybe that's naivety on my part, but from my perspective, that's purely an altruistic comment to make. The overall defense of the right to protest and stuff, obviously that's making a point about, the lack of freedom in Russia. But to bring that specific issue up, I don't think is necessarily a huge benefit for her from a political perspective. So, why can't we see that kind of altruism coming from the UK? And what is, how are we going to behave on the world stage if theoretically we are in that position?
I can see a way it's not just altruistic. Germany has huge ties with Russia that Britain doesn't have. It gets a lot of its gas from Russia. There's a lot of talk about the fact that Russia is far more tied into Germany, or rather Germany is more tied into Russia than we are. So it cannot stop having a dialogue with Russia. That's the reality of it. She can't just put loads of sanctions on and step away. Yeah. And actually what she's done is gone to a load of talks where they should be talking about Ukraine, which is the one subject Russia doesn't want to talk about, and she started talking about Chechnya. So actually this is a way for Merkel to look like the big liberal firebrand, when actually what she's doing is avoiding the main issue Russia doesn't want to talk about and keeping a dialogue going. Another quote from that press conference was, even if we disagree on things, we have to keep a dialogue going. And to come back to Arion's point about the self-interest, I actually think this was my point about Britain. If you go back in history, as much as we like to present ourselves as defenders of liberal values, I can't find an awful lot of examples where we've actually done that, where we have genuinely cut off our nose to further the rights of others at our own expense.
If anything, it's not even the failure to defend human rights on a global platform. It's like the failure to even try and put that idea out there. If you look at what's coming out of Downing Street at the moment, and if you look at what's in the press, it's all pettiness and paranoia and insularity.
Did this happen under Maggie Thatcher? Did it happen under Tony Blair? Did it happen under, John Major? Were they out there, travelling the world, sticking it to all these regimes that they were selling arms to? I mean, why do we have such great ties with Saudi Arabia? It's because we sell them lots and lots of arms, and we're not even stopping to sell them those arms, even though we know they're being used in nefarious ends in the Yemen. So we don't have a track record on this, and no country does really, except in certain respects America. Historically it did genuinely try to be outgoing. Again, I think that was partly because of its own self-image, but that's the one country that could probably be said to have done that altruistically in the past, and that has vacated that space. Yeah,
I think the important part for the role of leader of the free world is that you've got to be a staunch defender of liberal democracy. And what we've seen from Trump, he hasn't necessarily been hostile to all aspects. On certain things like on NATO, he's basically said, I only said that because I didn't know what it was, and now I've kind of changed my mind. But if there's any adjective you can use to describe Angela Merkel, it's staunch. She's very staunch. And she's brought, and that's where the stability you can no longer look to the US for that kind of stability now. And now it kind of looks like you can't look to the UK for it either, which I think is a bit of a depressing.
You need strong, stable leadership.
Strong, stable leadership. She keeps saying it, but it doesn't seem to be having an impact. I just worry that we're going into this kind of, what I would call almost an austerity mindset, where, when you're in danger or what have you, you shut down and you can only concentrate on, your survival instincts. So on the national level, the Conservatives keep saying, we can't afford to look after the disabled, we can't afford to save playgrounds, blah, 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 because we don't have the money. And people have by and large, I think, the electorate has that message has seeped in. You hear it said back on Vox Pops on BBC, well, we can't afford to do that. We can't afford foreign aid. We've got to take care of ours. And then we're seeing it, I think, played out on the world stage, like with Russia menacing, in the distance, Syria. We can't afford to take on things like, stop killing gay men in Chechnya.
I mean, coming back to this particular moment between Merkel and Putin, they have a long history together. But is this a significant period as far as you're concerned, because we're likely to see Putin change his position on any one of the issues that Merkel raised with him?
Putin doesn't strike me as the sort of person who's apt to do anything because of something somebody says. But I do think, it's an interesting addition to their personal history, which a lot of it is actually on a very personal level. She does seem to understand Putin quite well. They have a very strange psychological personal war going on that dates from when Putin brought his dog to a meeting, knowing that she was mauled by a dog in 1995 and is absolutely terrified of them, although he later said, "Oh, I didn't realise when I brought my dog," just like any world leader would do to a meeting. So she knows how to push his buttons, and I have seen it speculated, by some analysts that in doing this, she is implying that he doesn't have control of the autonomous region of Chechnya, and trying to do the old reverse psychology. You obviously can't get it under control. He's going to say, yes, I can. It seems like a pretty simplistic way of understanding what's going on there. But I think more simplistic things have worked in the past, to be honest. So, yeah, I think on a personal level, she has got that leverage over him.
We'll have to see how it plays out. So, Ashley, what have you brought along to push our psychological buttons?
From questionable global politics to questions over local politics.
We haven't spent quite £1 million, but we have spent a substantial sum more than my opponents, and I accept that. And actually, do you know what? I think that's okay, and I'll tell you why. This is a very important election, a new start in democracy, as you described in your introduction, for this region. It's 2.5 million people, so actually the sum is absolutely appropriate, and all the money has been raised for this campaign. We didn't have anything at the start, so it reflects the enthusiasm.
It's not fair, is it, though? If you spend £1 million, and I think the Lib Dem would say you should spend 50,000. I mean, it is skewed.
Everyone has the same rules to work within. We were able to
only
raise
within
that
the
money.
last few weeks.
That is true, and we've worked within that, but also the same rules before, actually, which says if you raise money, you can spend it, and that is what we have done.
That was Andy Street, the Conservative Party candidate for the Mayor of the West Midlands, talking to the Today programme on Monday. Ashley, if you'd said it was the local elections on Thursday, that alone would have pretty much qualified you for the most underreported story of the week. What's so significant about this?
Well, we've been talking about election expenses for a while now, or rather, some people have, and that itself has probably gone below the radar. But what's interesting here is this isn't a story of potential election fraud or anything like that, or even anything of or even approaching that. This is a story about a Conservative candidate who, very much within the rules, spent £1 million on a local election campaign. And it begs the question, I guess, in relation to those wider issues about expenses and about the way these elections are held, does this sort of inequality serve democracy?
Well, coming back to his position, he hasn't broken any rules, so let's just quickly touch on that. What's the problem specifically in this case?
In this case, so there's different rules for general and local elections. In the general election, you have a long period and you have a short period, or I should say a long campaign and a short campaign. The long campaign starts about 6 months before the 2017 general election will be very different. There is only a short campaign. But what that means is there's a strict limit of about £30,700, I think it is, per candidate in any constituency. Andy Street in January, February, March of this year spent £1 million on a local election campaign. Just putting literature out through the doors and, putting advertisements out, just hammering his message to people before the short period kicked in, because on local elections, they don't have those same rules.
I mean, it's staggering.
Is that fair is the question.
Yeah, it's staggering when you look at the fact that Labour has raised, £7 million for their entire general election campaign.
And it happens at national level, so there are stricter rules, but the Conservatives always outspend. So they always spend very, very close to their £19 million cap. I think the last election, Labour spent something like £12 million, and it sort of depends on what you can raise. And of course, you can't have absolute equality, but the question is, does this level of financial inequality, because of course all those businesses in the West Midlands are favouring the former managing director of John Lewis, who's standing for the Conservatives. Does that level of inequality, and whether it was £1 million, he disputes, he says it's slightly less than that, but does that level of inequality serve this democratic process?
Well, what do we think? Does spending lots of money, often from donors, help or hinder democracy, John?
Well, buying power is no way to create a mandate, is it? But on the other hand, it's a reflection, in a way, of where people want their money to go. If we live in a world of interest groups, and it's not exactly a plutocracy, but we're not far off it, I guess. It's naive to say it won't happen. To try and crack down on it would be difficult, I guess. I mean, then you'd be saying that you can't spend money on political causes outside of election periods. How do you police that? What's the political situation? I mean, it's already quite Byzantine from the sounds of it. It will become even more Byzantine if you crack down further.
It certainly is quite Byzantine. Local elections, for example. I've been quite close to one recently, and the campaign spending limit is £740 plus 6 pence per constituent. So it's, there are some sort of weird and wonderful rules in there.
Full disclosure, Ash, let us know what's your story.
As of 10 o'clock this morning, I will be in account to decide whether or not I'm going to be a county councillor in Dartford.
Yeah, coming back to this question then, what the argument for having massive amounts of electoral spend, often underwritten by wealthy donors, is that you get the issues out to the constituents. People know more about what they're voting on. They're more informed. They're able to make a better decision. Are there arguments for limiting the amount of money that's spent on elections?
I guess yes is the answer, and it's good that we have. I mean, at the moment, the idea is we have a short period, so therefore a particular period of time before the election, each party can only spend a certain amount, which gives them to some degree a level playing field in terms of share of voice. Because I don't think we were talking a couple of weeks ago about the Serbian election, where something like 92% of all election discussion or materials was related to one party. I don't think anyone thinks that necessarily served democracy. So the idea of this short restricted period, I guess the question then becomes, do we need to change the rules for local elections so that they have a similar sort of short and long period requirement, so that you can have a higher spending limit perhaps beforehand, and in this case the Conservatives are trying to make ground in traditional Labour areas, so getting their voice out there is one thing, but should they be able to spend this much more, and should there be like a general election style limit, I guess.
But before we suggest ideas for what could improve the situation, the idea of whether this massive spending hinders and if it does, to what extent, democracy depends on the outcome of the election. This is an interesting... We'll find
out, I suppose, whether this worked for him.
It's an interesting test case. I mean, as far as I can tell, it's kind of an unprecedented level of money to spend at that stage in a local election. So, measuring it'll be difficult to separate the impact of the spending from the impact of, people who may have just liked his policies. But it will be an interesting test case to see how many votes money can buy you. And if it proves to be not that many, then how do we measure the impact on democracy?
Oh, and that's a good question about how much money can buy. I mean, the biggest political weapon in the US last year was Donald Trump's Twitter account, and that was free. You can throw as much money as you want at anything nowadays in the social media world. It's the barriers have changed, the boundaries are blurred slightly.
And also to argue that it hinders democracy makes it sound like a very kind of abstract question. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Whereas I feel like in this instance, Andy Street, Conservative, arch capitalist. He's, got this massive amount of money to spend, and it's so unfair. However, if it was a story about, a Tory council and a grassroots Labour project had raised a ridiculous £1 million of fundraising online to get the Tories out, I feel like the same attitude wouldn't prevail. It wouldn't be seen as unfair. It would be seen as this amazing victory.
You're absolutely right. But that doesn't happen. And that doesn't happen for a reason, because to John's point earlier about what people are putting their money behind, it's not what people in inverted commas are putting their money behind. It's what a very small group of people who control a very large portion of wealth are putting their money behind. And even to the point about Donald Trump's Twitter account was free, but only because he's already a billionaire who already had reality television programs, who already had that platform.
Brand, yeah.
I know that, for example, in the campaign I've been involved in, we were trying to spend on... So we've spent a little bit of money, tiny amounts of money really, on social media. It's like £5 and £10 a time, and that will reach you like 1,000 people. And you end up at the end of this process with a net number of likes of about 170. So it's, that you can't just buy that. There's a lot of money.
Every vote counts, Ash.
Well, yeah, but to come back to that point though, the Conservatives spent £1.1 million declared, and there are some, that is something that I think Michael Crick was looking into, but they declared £1.1 million in spending on Facebook at the 2015 general election. Even they didn't have a platform ready there. That social media stuff you're seeing, they're paying for that as well.
So is the trajectory we're going, would you say, in UK politics in general towards higher expenditure? And if so, is there a problem with that?
I think the biggest amounts of money at the 2015 election was spent on mail shots. I think it's like $500,000 at a time.
It usually always is, yeah, because it's just the cost of printing.
Now, and I would imagine that is something that's not got a big long-term future in it. Bits of paper coming through letterboxes are not the way you communicate with the electorate these days. So, in a way, you could suggest that it's going to be different ways of spending rather than level of spending.
Yeah, prepare for your Facebook newsfeed to get very election heavy in the sort of future general elections to come, because it was proved in 2015 to be quite successful, and other parties have been quite slow to pick up on it. And your bang per buck, as it were, in terms of reach is much, much higher.
Coming back to Street, are we going to see the rules tightened in this particular case?
Well, it won't be for this election. I suspect this will be talked about. And I do think that stuff about the wider election scandal will filter down as well. I think that will provide a context for this debate. And it's not just about expenses either necessarily. I mean, it's also about restricted periods in terms of reporting and things like that. So, for example, for the local elections, there is a 3-week pre-election period where the civil service isn't meant to make announcements. That's not even fully enforced. It's much, much longer for the general election. And one day before that closed, that applied on the 13th of April this year. On the 12th of April, the government announced 131 new free schools in towns up and down the country that may or may not have had local elections, and may or may not have been run by Tory councils. So it's, I think those sort of things probably need to be looked at for local elections, given that people do look at all of these things when they consider the general political landscape.
We have a proud history of gerrymandering and stuff in this country, don't we? Going back centuries. It would be a shame to...
No need to change.
Yeah, exactly. Why end all that?
John, what have you brought for us today?
Do we have a new undisputed champion of the sporting universe?
And David Fields giving Vladimir Klitschko lots of time to recover by wiping the glove clean. Can Anthony Joshua put his man on the floor for the third time? He attempts a big left hook, but misses. Trying to close the distance now is Joshua. Vladimir Klitschko in desperate trouble. Every time he tries to move backwards, it's as though he's going to fall over. Joshua's got him backed into the corner. And Anthony Joshua teeing off. Referee David Fields has stepped in, and Anthony Joshua has stopped his man in the 11th round of an epic slugfest here at Wembley Arena.
That was Anthony Joshua ending his fight with Vladimir Klitschko, as described by the BBC Radio 5 live commentary team. Jonathan, this led both the front and back pages of the bank holiday weekend newspapers. It had a record crowd at Wembley. Why are we adding to the noise?
Well, yeah, it's not below the radar by any means, is it? But I think the question I wanted to ask was where we go now. So the fact is, one, that's great, everyone knows about it, but what happens next is the interesting question. Where does Joshua stand, and are we going back to an era of where the heavyweight champion of the world is a sporting icon who is known across the globe? It's already been mentioned that that Joshua is rivaling Andy Murray and David Beckham and Gareth Bale as the most famous and recognisable British sportsman in the world. He's got a long way to go. He's only got 2.2 million Facebook likes and 1.1 million Facebook followers, which is a lot, but small fry compared to someone like Cristiano Ronaldo. But I think we might be going back to an era where the heavyweight champion of the world actually carries a bit of kudos.
So who was the last heavyweight champion that people cared about?
There was Lennox Lewis in the early 2000s, but he's a bit of a footnote to history. I think before that, you're looking at Mike Tyson. I mean, he was one of the most recognisable sports people in the world in the 80s, and I think there hasn't been anyone like that since.
And is Joshua on par with Tyson in terms of either his raw fighting ability or his character and peculiar affection for pigeons?
I'm not sure he likes pigeons so much. There's a vacuum that needs to be filled there. Joshua says he wants to be a billionaire, and there's talk of him becoming it. It's hard to know if he can make it. The hype's going down very well in some quarters, and people are getting a little bit drunk on it. He's not Muhammad Ali. He probably never will be Muhammad Ali, but there's a possibility he could become like Muhammad Ali, if the stars align perfectly for him. But the question is, can we go back to that era?
So what is it that makes someone more than just a sports person? What turns them into a sporting celebrity?
It's the general ability to put yourself into the public consciousness, which is usually, frankly, about being a bit controversial. You look at Muhammad Ali, he was basically famous for all those lovely catchphrases he came out with, and then converting to Islam, and around the time when there was an awful lot of discussion about civil rights and stuff like that going on. Whereas someone like Andy Murray, who is undoubtedly very famous at the moment, but he's not dripping with charisma.
There's definitely a vacuum, especially I think in British sports, for that kind of big personality. We have every year when it comes to sports personality of the year, we have this conversation, but none of them are personalities. And Andy Murray, obviously famously quite bland. And even if you look at the David Beckham emails, that was turned into a gigantic scandal. He was a national treasure, but now he's betrayed us all because we've seen what he's really like. Well, I mean, it wasn't awful. It didn't show him in his best light, but it certainly had a lot of personality. But it seems like that has kind of been squeezed out recently. And if you look at, the Olympians as well, all of the, Team GB, very nice, very pleasant people, but not a huge amount of personalities in there. So there's definitely a room for big personality.
You're onto something there about the professionalisation of sport removing charisma as well, because the thing about Mike Tyson was he wasn't the greatest professional athlete, was he? Both in terms of his conduct in the ring and I believe outside of it. I would be willing to stand corrected. I'm a bit young for it.
I'm not
really,
sure
but-
you will be corrected on that. I think you're correct.
So, but now the level of athleticism and the level of training that goes in. I mean, Olympians are a good example. These were originally like as an amateur sports thing. Now it's, training 365 days a year. These people are specialists in very niche fields a lot of the time.
Well, this is it. You look at people like Ronaldo, Messi, Federer. They are awesome at what they do. But what do they do apart from what they do?
Yeah.
There isn't a great deal to it. Whereas the heavyweight thing, it has this history. It's a storied history. You have people like Muhammad Ali. You have Joe Frazier, Rocky Marciano, people who meant something to society. And that in itself, I think, created a vacuum which Joshua has the sort of charisma to fill.
Look, I only became aware of him in the last 5 or 6 days, I must confess, but he doesn't strike me as the most charismatic individual in the whole world. And when you compare him to, say, a Tyson Fury, who had oodles of charisma, why is he going to be bigger than Fury?
Well, that I think comes down to marketing, because you're not going to get millions and millions of people, millions of backers for someone like Tyson Fury. He's too much a wild card. Joshua, I mean, we live in a different era now to the 70s, so it does come down to marketing and media exposure. Now, he is a marketer's dream. He's good looking, he's witty, he's nice, he's big and he's brawny and he's going to beat up the baddies. So he's already got a shed load of sponsors, and there's only going to be more people queuing up, and that's the sort of thing that can catapult his profile higher and higher.
And to come off of what you were saying about Tyson Fury, like a lot of the kind of problem, the obstacle towards him becoming that kind of national treasure status was, his comments about gay people, some of his religious views are kind of a bit out there for now, and I think it would be easy to say that the reason that people like that can no longer be on top is that it'd be easy to say it's political correctness. You can't say things, if you had a big personality these days you'd get in trouble. But I think it might even go wider than that, because if you think about it, maybe we've all just become more well behaved. We keep reading about how people are drinking less, we don't rave anymore, young people are all about pensions. I just think if we had John McEnroe now, we look back fondly on John McEnroe. He became a kind of cultural meme. If someone behaved like that today, I think there'd be a lot of po-faced headlines and conversations about what a disgrace he was.
Well, and as they were at the time. But you're right, people don't want the controversy in a negative way, where Joshua actually brings it in a positive way. But he's also, a role model as well. That's the thing. These great sports figures kind of stood up for something. Whereas Joshua actually kind of does that. He's black, he's British, he's of African descent, he's diversity personified, he's from Watford, he's being from Watford perhaps doesn't sound like the most glamorous thing in the world, but he actually is he's a representation of something.
Yeah, thinking about sporting personalities and the void of personalities, how did David Beckham come to be so famous, apart from the fact that he was possibly the most handsome man in the whole world?
Well, I mean, I think again marketing has an issue there. I mean, he was identified pretty early on as someone who could sell a lot of shirts, and he's been coached. The brands who got behind him knew that he could do a job for them, and they're the ones that polish his image.
So these days, is image more important than sporting prowess? Because he was never the best footballer.
No, I mean, that's an interesting point about it. I mean, he's one of the most famous people on the planet, but he was probably, third or fourth best in that Man United team that came through in 1992. You have to be good, obviously, but in boxing, you also have, I mean, you can't, it's not a team sport, boxing, and that's one of the things about it. You're not beholden to your team. You can go wherever you want in the world. You are your own man. Whereas in football, you can look great in a mediocre team. You can look brilliant or you can look fantastic in a team that's really, really good, even if you're not that great.
I'd make a couple of points about David Beckham, though. One of them is he was, although he's not the fastest runner, he wasn't the greatest dribbler. that there was a whole thing around the time he came through about the way he did take a free kick, for example, and the way he got the ball to curl.
He was very good on a dead ball.
Yeah, that I mean, we had a film, Bend It Like Beckham, because and I remember watching a news broadcast where they spent 10 minutes on how he gets the ball to spin that much. So,
10 minutes of your life you'll never get back.
And I was a teenager when he put in that free kick against Greece at Wembley that got us to the World Cup. This is and I think he scored one against Ecuador at the World Cup we then sort of got to. So he was a very good footballer. He was a captain of England when we beat Argentina in the group stage and avenged 1998. And that brings me on to my second point. He didn't just get this because of marketing. There was also a big controversy with Beckham. When he kicked Diego Simeone in 1998, got sent off, and was roundly blamed for England getting kicked out of that World Cup. Man United fans were holding effigies of him hanging from a noose in their own stands.
I think it was West Ham, wasn't it?
It may have been West Ham, so I do apologise. It may have been West Ham. But nonetheless, domestic fans who would have been supporting England at that World Cup were holding images of their future captain hanging from a noose. that probably did more to make him famous than any number of underwear ads.
And look, it's very early days for Joshua. He's still got the potential to go in the Beckham direction, in the positive or the negative sense. You know, he could have a scandal, he could bite someone's ear off, anything could happen at this stage.
Boxing is littered with excellent stories of the great white hope who ends up on his arse and becomes a bum, you know.
Well, let's hope that that's not what becomes of us after this, or some better segue. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jonathan Harwood, Rebecca Gillie and Ashley Wassall. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, download our free iPhone app, The Weekday, or get the magazine direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And you can hear us every week on The Week Unwrapped. Just hit subscribe on your podcast app of choice. I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer is Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Ollie is back for the next episode, so until we meet again to unwrap next week, goodbye.